up and running. I don't know if you want to click on it and see if it looks good.
It's setting it up right now.
Okay, perfect.
And we should be live.
Okay, wonderful. Hi, folks. Welcome to the Puget Sound Energy Resource Planning Advisory Group meeting. We're going to be getting started in 3 to 4 minutes. So we'll just go ahead and keep ourselves on mute and hang tight until we can kick things off. Okay, well, welcome to the Puget Sound Energy Resource Planning Advisory Group meeting. We are about to get started, so we'll give folks just another couple of minutes as people join. So thanks for coming. See, some of the members are already here, and feel free if you don't mind. Sometimes it's really nice to see which organization you're with next to your name. So if you don't mind adding a comma with your organization or agency, we would greatly appreciate that. And we will get started just a little bit after 1 o'clock. Thanks, everyone. Hey, folks. Nice to see your faces. Thanks for being here. We're just giving people a few more moments to get online and get acquainted, and then we'll get started and kick things off for the public as well. If you are watching us on YouTube, this should be live streaming, and if you need to share that link with anybody, that was also included in the materials that were sent out. If you need it, please feel free to message us or just let us know, and happy to send that your way again. Looks like we've got some public members here, so thanks so much for coming and observing today. Okay. I'm just going to look to Ray and see if you'd like to wait another minute or so, or if we should go ahead and get started. Okay. All right, getting the go ahead. So, well, hello, everybody, and welcome again to the Puget Sound Energy's Resource Planning meeting. I'm Annie Kilberg-Smith, and I'm going to be facilitating today's meeting. I am a contractor with a company called Triangle Associates, and so we'll be facilitating this session, and we've been doing past sessions for quite a while, future ones, so really appreciate being here. I want to thank you all for spending your afternoon with us, and whether you're a member, a presenter, or from the public via live stream, we really greatly appreciate your time and energy spent on this effort and spending a couple hours with us. Next slide. All right, so before we dive in, you can find your Zoom controls either at the top or bottom of your screen, depending on your device. That's where RPAG members will see things like raise hand, which we would ask you to use when you have a question or to get in the queue. I know folks have had trouble with that in the past, so I'd love to see you practice with that. Um, I, I would love to see if you just go to, if there's a dot, dot, dot more on your control panel and you can go to React. And then you should be able to click on raise hand, give yourself a thumbs up, give yourself a clap, give yourself a heart. Great, seeing lots of those. Let us know if you can't do that. I know people got that was a little confusing last time, and Ben is here to help you if you need some more help with that. So that's one of the features we would like you to all be using today. Also, just muting and unmuting yourself. There's the chat box for our PEG members. There's also captions, and you can translate those. And if you need help with the instructions on that, Ben's here to help. And then, of course, the reactions. If you like something, give it a thumbs up, a heart, an applaud. We love to see those. If anything's hiding, just go ahead and move your mouse to tap on the screen and things should pop up. Note that we do not have the Q&A tool open. We're really just focusing on using the chat today. And then a quick reminder that this is a webinar format, so you won't be able to see the public observers unless they provide, or you won't be able to hear them unless they provide public comment. So this meeting is really intended for the RPEG members to interact directly with each other and PSE, and then we save that public comment for the end. So again, if you're having technical trouble, go ahead, feel free to chat with my colleague Ben Relampagos, who is here and willing to help you resolve any technical issues. Oh, and then one last thing on the Zoom controls for chatting. This is just a Zoom feature that we cannot change automatically. So you'll see the two box. And if you want to chat to hosts and panelists, that's just everybody that you can see on video today. If you need to share chat with everyone, including the public, you will have to drop that down to everyone. And if you want to direct message someone, you'll just have to select that person. Okay, next slide. So just a few facilitator requests to help keep things flowing. Let's really aim to keep things constructive and courteous with each other, and hoping that you can all trust me to help guide us through these conversations together. We'd like to try to avoid using acronyms too much, or at least explain them if you are going to use them. And same goes for technical questions. If you've got to share more than what's outside of today's topics, please feel free to use the feedback form or email the isp@pse.com. And a heads up that public comment will be coming after PSE's presentation, so we'll make space for that then. And Ben, if you don't mind putting those links in the chat for folks so that they have those handy, I'd greatly appreciate it. Next slide. All right, so before we jump in, a quick safety moment with Memorial Day weekend coming up. If you're heading out to the water, please remember, even if it's warm out, lakes and rivers can still be cold. So please be careful and keep an eye on kids, especially. Don't swim or drive under a boat, or drive a boat under the influence. I guess you wouldn't drive under a boat too. And always please wear a life jacket. If you're grilling, keep it supervised, and please wear sunscreen. Even when it's cloudy, the sun can sneak up on you, especially between 11 and 5. All right, next slide. All right, we have four main presenters from PSC today, including Elizabeth Hosner, Michaela Levine, Steve Schuneman, and Katrin Olson. In addition to our speakers, we have several PSC colleagues and RPAG members here today. So as part of introductions, we're not going to do verbal ones. But if you are an RPAG member or part of PSC, we'd love for you to introduce yourself in the chat. Ben will put those instructions in the chat, but please just enter your name, who you represent or organization you're with, and what you're looking forward to in the agenda today. We'd love to see that information waterfall in the chat while we keep going. Next slide. So here's our plan for the next couple hours. We'll start with electric modeling, then we're going to spend some time on resource adequacy, followed by hydro, resource alternatives, emerging resources, and geothermal modeling and costs. So we've got a lot to touch base on today in 2 hours. We also want to try really hard to get to the RPEG charter document. We've been back and forthing with folks on that for a couple months now, and we'd like to wrap that up and get it adopted in principle if possible. If you have to jump early, no worries. Please just let us know, and we can always update you after today's meeting. Next slide. So today we're diving into electric modeling and resource adequacy planning for PSE's 2027 Integrated System Plan. It's a technical topic, but an important one. So PSE is really hoping to get your input as they walk through the assumptions and approaches. So we want to hear from all of you as much as you're comfortable sharing or providing comment and questions. And of course, as I mentioned, we're also hoping to adopt that charter and principle. So if you haven't looked at that since the last time we met, because we did discuss it at the last meeting, please feel free to pull that up in your email while we go through the meeting today. Next slide. So this slide is really focused on what we're hoping to get from all of you today. So we'd love to hear your questions, your reflections, and your advice on today's topics and not have I know these tend to be pretty presentation heavy, and PSE also wants to hear from all of you. So let us know if anything feels unclear or missing. If you're just listening and making reflections, that's okay too. And if there are areas where we need to dig deeper, please let us know. That type of information is helpful for future meetings. And this is also a great time to flag any risks, tensions, or misalignments that you're seeing early on so that PSE is aware of those things from the get-go. Wanted to just pause here and just see if you have any questions about what we're asking you to participate in today, any questions on the agenda, or anything overall before we jump in. And yes, one more quick logistics reminder would be great if you are comfortable and you're available to turn on your camera. We'd love to see your faces, but also know that a lot of people might be eating lunch or have other things during this time, but always nice to see your faces if possible. Great, and I'm seeing lots of introductions in the chat. Thank you all. We'll go ahead and just keep having those come in. If you're just joining, we're just asking you to introduce yourself in the chat with name, organization, what you're looking forward to on the agenda today. Okay. And one more thing, just because I saw a couple people join after we got started, if you have trouble raising your hand or taking yourself on or off mute, please just put that information in the chat and we'll make sure to get your technical issue resolved as quickly as we can. Okay. All right. Well, I think that's it from me. What I'm going to do is ask you to go to the next slide. And I want to segue from going into the introduction part of this meeting into the presentation portion. So I'm going to introduce Elizabeth Hosner from PSE to provide an overview of electric modeling. Elizabeth, over to you.
Great, thank you. My name is Elizabeth. I'm with PSC. I manage the resource planning team, working on the electric analysis. So next slide, please. It's just kind of an overall of where we're going to be at for this discussion today. So we've kind of built out the building blocks of what will be in the ISP. I will be focusing on the electric energy supply piece of kind of the ISP and the building blocks through some of our conversations today and getting feedback. Next slide. This is just kind of looking at where we are for the year. We're here May 15th, looking at the electric modeling and resource adequacy work. There will be 2 more meetings in June on the electric vehicle forecast and gas modeling. Another meeting in July on the demand forecast, and then we'll be skipping August, and the next meeting after that will be in September and continue for the year. And I think next slide. Just kind of overall, I will be going through the big picture overall of what the electric supply modeling is going to be looking like. We had done a presentation on May 31st of last year. There's a link into that meeting where we started setting up for the electric modeling as part of the 2025 analysis. I'll be kind of building off of that presentation and really focusing on some of the feedback we received and some of the updates and changes we've made into the work that's going into the ISP. So I will be kind of going over the electric modeling overview of how we do our electric modeling. We'll then be going through the resource adequacy analysis and methodology. So we do have our consultants here from E3 to go through that work. And then we'll also be going through the supply side resource and alternatives. And given times that we have, I want to make sure there's plenty of time for discussions of the resources, what we're modeling. And so this discussion today will be focused on the resources themselves and looking at the cost of the resources. And then we'll have a follow-up meeting in September. We'll be focusing on the equity considerations in the ISP and how that will be playing out. So I just want to make sure there's enough time for the different topics. I know these are all very exciting topics. We want to make sure we have time for discussions in these meetings as well. And we'll also be coming back next fall with some of the results from our analysis and seeing how things are looking as well. And I think next slide, please. Just kind of an overall of how the electric supply modeling fits into the integrated resource plan. So what we've been going through is a lot of the assumptions and inputs that go into the model. So we take each one of the pieces of the transmission that we've been through in February, the distributed resources and customer programs that we went through in March, the demand forecast, which will be coming up in July, and the demand side resources. And then today we're focusing on the supply side resources. And we grab all this information and all this feeds into the electric modeling where we go through the full portfolio modeling for new resources. It's a pretty iterative process. So we'll have a starting point, we'll go through our portfolio modeling, and we might iterate through changes to different assumptions, see how that will affect the results. So we will be going back and forth quite a bit between the inputs and our models and working with the different teams to making sure we're lining everything up as well. Really at the end, what we're trying to do is kind of create this whole modeling process. We'll probably create multiple different portfolios coming out of this, depending on our assumptions and inputs, iterating through different demand forecasts based off of the different electrification scenarios that we'll be looking at, adjusting the demand side resources that go with those different demand forecasts, and adjusting all the assumptions going in to create these kind of fully integrated scenarios that we're looking at. Overall, what we'll get is kind of an optimized portfolio of electric resources, demand side resources, and customer programs, how the transmission will fit in. So that will be kind of overall the outputs that we'll be getting through in this modeling process. And next slide, please. So this is kind of just an overview of the models that we use and how we go about. This is not the complete picture of everything that comes in and out of our models, but really the main model that we use for the generation modeling is Aurora. It's a model owned by Energy Exemplar, and we use it in a couple different ways. The first way is to produce an electric power price. And then that electric power price will then feed into our portfolio model, which is kind of a second model that we use also in Aurora. And so this is a capacity expansion model. And in this, that's where we put all these assumptions in. We pull the power prices, gas prices, all that information into the model. And this will create a full capacity expansion based off of those assumptions of builds, maybe retirements, and this full portfolio piece put together. And it's through this process that we will iterate through each of the different pieces and assumptions and creating different portfolios to look at. And eventually we'll get to what would be the kind of the final view of how we're seeing everything considered in. Yeah, thank you. And so I'm kind of teeing up for our next conversation, which will be on resource adequacy. So a little bit of background, PSE first started doing resource adequacy analysis in the 2009 IRP. And this original analysis was based off of what was a loss of load probability approach. And this mimicked a lot of what was happening with the Northwest Power and Conservation Council, who also did a resource adequacy analysis. So we're tying in a lot to that work. And we proceeded with this analysis, tying into the council's work through to the 2021 IRP. And so we received quite a bit of feedback in that 21 IRP. And from that feedback, we actually hired E3 to do kind of a review of our resource adequacy analysis and give recommendations of where we can make improvements to help this process better in the future. And so through that, we end up E3 kind of put this report together in 2021. The overall report came through with our approach was sound. We were using the loss of load probability. We're tying into the regional work, but they came back with recommendations for improvements that we could be making. And so for the 2023 progress report, we hired E3 to do the resource adequacy analysis accounting for the improvements, and we've been tracking through their suggestions and making improvements as we've been going. And so E3 is still working on a resource adequacy analysis for this ISP, and the final piece of this recommendations they made for resource correlations. That's the final piece that will be coming into this ISP for all the updates. So this will actually complete the review that they did and making some of the improved changes that they recommended as well. And I think there's a question.
Yeah, a question from Quinn.
Hi, Quinn Weber with Washington UTC. So I'm curious, I think I know what resource correlations is. It's that just like how everything fits together.
Yeah, so what that piece was is we had the loads and the hydro correlated with temperatures, but then we had kind of separate wind and solar shapes. And so now this iteration through is we're trying to get all of that tied back together. So we've got all the correlations with loads, hydro, and the wind and solar shapes, the final piece, to make sure we're tying back into the same wind regimes or the same temperatures and creation through all the resources. So everything's correlated together.
And that includes batteries.
Batteries charge, so batteries are not dependent on the temperatures.
True. Well, sort of, but yeah. No need to get too technical.
Yeah, but we've done quite a bit of improvements on how we set up the battery characteristics with E3 and how the batteries are being dispatched to the model. So that's all included in their modeling work.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Quinn. While we're paused, I'll just see if there's any other questions so far for Elizabeth. Yeah, Dennis.
You know, back to that first slide, the Tetris picture. Looks like you've got 7 different functions. Does that mean you have 7 different groups, or some of those combined functions within one group? That's the first question. I'll let you answer that one, I guess, first.
So those are different teams will be coming in with different discussions. So for example, like there was a long haul transmission and local transmission they presented in February. Will be coming in with the gas, but these are all 7 different teams groups that will be coming in to present on information.
Okay. And with that, with the different groups, are similar assumptions coordinated between the groups for consistency in the model? And how's that done?
So this is where all of our scenario creation is coming together. So what we're doing is creating a set of assumptions and all the work we're doing together. And so when we create our models and our starting point and assumptions, we are all working on the same set. For example, we'll be getting a demand forecast, an electric and gas demand forecast that coordinates together with the assumptions on pieces of gas to electric or how that's working in the demand. The demand side resources will be correlated to that demand forecast. And then all of that will be handed out, going out to the local and regional transmission planning. And that will be coming to us for energy supply planning, the gas energy supply planning. So we'll be planning all under the different scenarios and assumptions together to meet a specific level of demand that's needed and assumptions in there.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dennis. And then if you want to go back, Jessa, if you want to go back to, yeah, perfect. Elizabeth, did you have anything else on this slide before we move into any other questions?
No, and I think we'll be handing it off to E3 after this, if there's any more questions.
Yeah. Great. Yeah. Any other questions for folks before we move into E3's presentation? Okay. Great. Well, thank you, Elizabeth. And we'll go ahead and introduce Michaela Levine with E3 Consulting, who's going to be presenting on resource adequacy, just like Elizabeth was referring to, and give us an overview of that. And Michaela, I know we have about 45 minutes for your presentation. We are running a little bit over. So I just wanted to give you that note, but we'll try to get through things quickly as well as answer everybody's questions the best we can. So Michaela, over to you.
Thank you, Annie. Hi, everyone. It's great to be with you today. I'm Michaela Levine. I'm a senior managing consultant in E3's Integrated System Planning Group, and I'm also joined online by my colleague, Erin Burdick, who's a director in E3's Integrated System Planning Group. So today, as Annie and Elizabeth teed us up, we're going to talk a little bit about background and terminology that's used when we are talking about resource adequacy. We'll go through E3's scope of work and how we are supporting PSE in the ISP. And then we'll highlight some of the changes that Elizabeth already called out that we're making in the 27 ISP compared to the 2025 analysis. So let's go to the next slide and get started. One more, please. Great. So first, just to define some terms, what is resource adequacy? Resource adequacy, or RA, is a measure of a portfolio's ability to meet load under a wide range of conditions. And those wide range of conditions account for variability both in the supply side and the demand side. So when we're thinking about the demand side, really that variability is driven by weather events and extreme weather events. So that can include, the extreme winter storm that the region experienced in January 2024, or the heat dome that was experienced in the region in June of 2021. So even though PSE is a winter peaking system, it's really important to characterize the kind of extreme events that the system could experience both in summer and winter and throughout the year. And then when we're talking about variability on the supply side, I think most people think of the variability of renewable generation that kind of varies by hour based off weather conditions, the sun shining, the wind is blowing. But there's also variability to consider in the availability of resources like thermal generation and forced outage rates, and the variability of just there being enough energy in the system to charge storage and have that be available when needed. No electric system can be planned to be perfectly adequate. So the practice in the industry is really to define a reliability standard and then build your system to meet that standard. One of the most common standards in use in the industry is 0.1 LOE, or loss of load expectations. That's a really common industry standard, and it's also what is used by the Western Resource Adequacy Program. And with that standard, if PSE were to design their system to meet that, they could expect to see 1 day with loss of load every 10 years. So that's the standard that PSE is using for this 27 ISP. Let's go to the next slide, please. So next, to define some terminology here, the first term we want to define and describe is called the planning reserve margin. And the planning reserve margin is the total amount of capacity needed to satisfy the reliability target. It is commonly measured as a percentage above the median or normal or 1 and 2 peak load. So this is a key constraint that goes from the resource adequacy modeling into the portfolio expansion modeling, and really sets the kind of requirement of the amount of capacity that is needed to be identified and selected in that portfolio expansion model to have the system be adequate and reliable. The way we measure how resources can contribute to meeting the capacity requirements of the system is the effective load carrying capability, or ELCC. So the ELCC is the equivalent perfect capacity that a resource can contribute to meeting PSE's reliability target. It is commonly described as a percentage of nameplate capacity. And since no resource is ever perfect, it's always a percentage less than 100. So E3 goes through our analysis, and we quantify how existing or planned resources can contribute to meeting PSE's planning reserve margin. And then we identify any shortfall that exists between the existing or planned portfolio and what is needed to satisfy the reliability requirement. And then to fill that shortfall in the portfolio expansion model, E3 provides ELCC values for generic or candidate resources that model can select. I see a hand up already from Katie. Should we take that question, Annie, or should we keep moving with our time constraint?
No, I think it's good to take questions as we go if we can. So yeah, Katie.
Thanks, Michaela. Just a question or a couple questions on this. How does this interact with the Western Resource Adequacy Program? And is RAP providing these values to PSE, or are these internal, I guess, or E3 values? And is the ELCC for all resources or just renewables? If it's just renewables, what is the capacity accreditation for thermal resources? Thanks.
Great questions. I'll answer your second one first, and then I'll kick it to PSE to talk about the RAP implications. But yes, we will be modeling ELCCs for both renewable resources, and we'll get to the full list we'll study at the end of the presentation, this section of the presentation, as well as thermal resources. And the ELCCs of those thermal resources will be determined through the analysis and really are also a function of kind of assumptions around force outage rates of those resources. And Philip, do you want to talk about the RAP?
Sure. Yeah, thank you. So I'm Philip Popoff, Director of Resource Planning here at PSE. What we've asked E3 to do is one of the things that they'll be doing as part of this contract for us is providing some forecast of RAP metrics. The RAP doesn't provide any kind of forecast of metrics. So I've mentioned a couple times that I don't even remember now, maybe a year and a half ago, I was the lead on the RAP's long-term metrics working group, but the RAP decided they didn't have the bandwidth to deal with trying to figure out the forecasting as well as getting the operational program up and running. So they kind of put that on hold. I think they're starting to have those conversations again. Maybe they're getting to a point where they feel like they're ready to start investigating that again. But at this point, we are one of the things, like I mentioned, that we've asked E3 to do is to forecast those RAP metrics. And E3 is also doing a study for a number of different utilities in the Pacific Northwest. We all kind of got together, and not all of us, but several utilities got together and commissioned E3 to do this broader regional RA study, quite similar to what they're doing for us, but a different perspective that covers the whole RAP footprint to once again get some insights into what those metrics might look like in the future. So, we'll have to see what all those metrics look like and exactly what we're going to wind up doing with them all. But I think it's really important we're trying to harmonize with the RAP. So to the extent that we're able to do that, we'll do that. If not, we'll do it as a sensitivity or something.
Thanks, Philip. And we have a question in the chat from Quinn. While we're on this topic, will PSE use the RAP, PRM, and ELCC metrics before the binding phase of the RAP begins?
I don't know. It depends on what those look like. I would suspect. So we have resource adequacy metrics under CETA. We're supposed to have resource adequacy metrics, and we do. So if we basically describe we're going to transition over to the RAP metrics, then that becomes our RA metrics under CETA. So I think that either way it'll be clear. And I think especially if the RAP like planning reserve margin and ELCCs, if all of that comes together to show a lower resource need, I suspect that's exactly what we would be doing. We wouldn't want to overbuild in anticipation of going into RAP, which would then have a lower requirement.
Thanks for that, Philip, and that question, Quinn. Michaela, I'll let you keep going if you'd like.
Great. Let's go to the next slide and talk a little bit more detail about the reliability planning modeling framework. So there are really kind of three key steps to this framework and developing those two metrics we just talked about in the previous slide, the planning reserve margin and ELCCs. And the first step is to just develop a really robust set of data that we study in a loss of load probability model. And that set of data is really meant to capture the really broad range of conditions that the system might see. So we look at load and variability of load between years across a range of weather conditions. We also look at the variability of renewable generation across a range of conditions and hydro availability. And we also, with our probability model, can simulate the potential for force outages on resources like like thermal resources and storage resources. And so ultimately get an hourly simulation of the system across thousands of years to get a really robust set of data to understand the range, how the system performs under a range of conditions. The next step is to identify the need for capacity for the system. And it's kind of illustrated in this chart here. The amount of perfect capacity or the total resource need that a system has is really a function of the variability of the system's loads, as well as the reliability target. And again, we're using that loss of load expectation as the reliability target. So from this system, we determine what the total resource need of the system is. And that total resource need translates into that planning research margin we just talked about, dividing that total resource need megawatts divided by the 1 to 2 peak load and subtracting 1 gives you that PRM percentage that we defined previously. The third step then is to study resource accreditation. And so for both those existing and new candidate resources, we develop an ELCC. And, again, no resource is perfectly reliable. Thermal resources have forced outage rates, which make them less than perfectly reliable. Energy storage also is not perfectly reliable. Battery storage is not perfectly reliable. They experience forced outage rates. And then also, if there's a shortage of energy in the system across a period of time, they may not have enough energy to be charging and then be available when needed. And, and then variable resources like solar and wind might not be generating when the system has a period of need. So the ELCC is really looking at how adding a resource to the system, offsets the need for perfect capacity. And that's how we really measure that ELCC value. And again, we really define it as a percentage of the nameplate capacity of the resource. Let's go to the next slide. So when we develop ELCCs, E3 really tries to capture how PSE's portfolio might evolve over time and how those resources in the portfolio interact and contribute to meeting PSE's total resource need. There are really 2 dynamics that are important to capture when we're developing ELCCs. One is saturation effects, which is a dynamic that occurs within resources of the same class. So the class of resources of wind resources, the class of resources of solar resources. And then there's the interactive effects, how resources of different classes interact. So the first two panels here on this left, on this diagram here are meant to illustrate the impact of saturation effects within a single resource class. So the blue line on these charts is illustrating kind of load on a summer day. And in the first set, we're seeing how adding a variable resource, in this example, solar, leads to saturation. So that solar shape, generates in the middle of the day, has this kind of bell curve pattern, tends to push out the system peak into later hours of the day. So that adding increasing quantities of solar reduces the amount that solar can contribute to meeting the system's needs. So that leads to kind of a saturation effect of that solar. In the second panel, we illustrate this how storage exhibits saturation effects. So storage can really shave the peak of the system, but it also works to broaden the length of the peak of the system, which means that you need increasing quantities of storage capacity to get the same amount of load reduction as you keep broadening that peak as you add more and more quantities. So those 2 effects are saturation effects. But then resources of 2 different classes, like in this is illustrated in this third panel of solar and storage together, can exhibit interactive effects where the sum is greater than the individual parts. So as illustrated here in this last diagram, how solar tends to push the peak later in the evening, it also tends to shorten that net peak period. And by shortening that net peak period, the storage becomes a more effective resource in meeting system needs. So E3 will try to capture these dynamics by modeling how adding new resources can interact with PSE's existing portfolio and also capturing kind of those saturation effects as PSE adds more and more resources to the portfolio.
Thanks, Michaela. And it looks like we have a question from Lisa.
Hi, yes, thank you. I think it's just because you went through it quickly and I need to think about it, but could you explain again, maybe even using the same words about how the impacts of storage here? Because I think that's really critical.
Yeah. So let's say your first megawatt of storage is able to reduce your peak by a megawatt. But that also kind of shaves the peak. So that first kind of dark purple wedge ends up getting you to that next lighter purple wedge. And now the net load after that first wedge of purple is flatter and broader.
Okay, that makes sense, like mathematically and graphically. That's great. Can you like, so is that a problem? Is that, so I want to understand, is that good or bad? And I know that's a very basic question and hard to answer, but just the way it sounds doesn't sound, it sounds maybe worse than it really is.
Yeah, I would. The question of like how much storage is cost optimal is a question for the portfolio analysis. What this is just indicating is that there is diminishing capacity value for storage as you keep adding more and more quantities of it. Whether that diminishing capacity value means it's not cost effective or not is not a question we ask in the resource adequacy modeling.
Great, thanks.
Thanks, Lisa. All right, Michaela, if you want to keep going.
For the next slide, please. Okay, so here's a little bit of overview, kind of building off of what Elizabeth shared about the electric portfolio development process. And here we're just going to show there's kind of three key steps to this. So the first step is really what we've been focusing on and discussing in our reliability model using E3's recap model, or loss load probability model. We developed those planning reserve margin and technology ELCC curves that feed into the portfolio expansion model. So that planning reserve margin tells the portfolio model how much capacity it needs to build, and the technology ELCC curves tells that model how much each resource type can contribute to meeting that capacity need. So then we'll hand that off to PSE's team, who will do their portfolio expansion modeling and develop these optimized resource portfolios that meet both the reliability requirements of the system as well as other constraints like clean energy targets while trying to minimize costs. And then in the third step of this process, PSE will hand us those optimized portfolios back to E3's reliability modeling and our recap model, where we'll test if that portfolio is adequate to meeting this reliability requirements of the system. And that's a pretty common standard, that kind of back-end check or round trip, if you want to call it, to evaluate the reliability of a portfolio. So we'll do that to ensure that we have portfolios coming out of this process that are adequate.
Yeah, Lisa, you have a question?
I do. So this diagram, and maybe it's just simplified, it's putting the planning reserve margin and telling the portfolio expansion model, what the reserve margin should be. And I'm really glad to see the iteration, that you go back into the model. But I'm also trying to understand, every different portfolio that the utility runs is going to have really different metrics for reliability, tail bar, all the different metrics that the utility uses. And really driven in large part by like the types of resources. So, you change the portfolio mix and it's going to look different. It'd still be reliable, but it's going to, the metrics are going to look different. And so I'm just wondering about, the way this is depicted with sort of like, it looks like a fixed planning reserve margin. If it's really indeed fixed in the end. I don't know if, hopefully my question's understandable.
Yeah, maybe one way to think about it, Lisa, is that the planning reserve margin is not the only constraint in the portfolio expansion model. It might not necessarily be the binding constraint. I don't think we can judge that until we get into that, until PSE gets into that modeling. But if it is a binding constraint in kind of all the scenarios that PSE studies, we would see that all the portfolios result in kind of the same reliability metric on the portfolio. They still meet the same RA requirements. If it's not a binding constraint, it is possible that the portfolios have a different kind of reliability metric at the end of it, but I think that's still to be determined. Does PSE want to add anything else to that?
Yeah, hi, this is Philip again. Lisa, what I'd say is, yeah, we think it's really important to take that look on the back end to because there's all these interactive effects that calculating the ELCCs doesn't take into consideration, like wind in Wyoming versus wind in Washington. Yeah, there's definitely a lot of diversity, but the wind might be blowing all the time exactly at the same time that we need it, right? So there might be lots of diversity during times that doesn't really matter. But we have we might not necessarily reflect that interactive effect. So checking on the back end makes sure that all the ELCCs that were calculated going in did what they were supposed to do on the back end. And then to the extent that we're checking different alternative preferred portfolios, we check a few of those through the RA model, we'll get all of those RA metrics so that hopefully, right, if everything worked well, we're achieving at least the 1 in 10 LOLE. And then we can also have additional information from those other metrics on, maybe if two portfolios are, let's say they cost about the same, they have about the same LOLE, well, maybe they have significantly different other RA metrics that we would kind of use to reason through why we might prefer one portfolio over another. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's really helpful. And it makes, yeah, I mean, because the plan, that arrow just like looks very definitive there. The planning reserve margin in, we're done.
Right. Yeah, that's why that iterative process, that's why I think that's super important, just to make sure that it could happen, I suppose. I don't know if it could happen, but it could happen that it happens to be a portfolio mix gets more capacity than you needed, to hit that with that planning reserve margin. That could happen. Probably not, but it could, So I think it's important on both sides to make sure that you're not underbuilding or overbuilding. And then all the other metrics, as you mentioned, there's all the other implications, and we'll get all of those metrics from our friends at E3.
Thanks, Philip and Lisa, on that. I do have a couple other questions. So we've got Quinn and then Dennis. I'll go to Quinn and then Dennis after that.
Yeah, thanks, Philip. That was instructive. And same, Michaela. Philip, are you saying that you pick a preferred portfolio and then run the RA metrics as opposed to running the RA metrics on just a certain portfolio and then factoring that into whether or not it's preferred?
I think that we'll have to develop a few different preferred portfolios. And just I think we need to be a little careful, because in the ISP world, portfolio is starting to mean maybe something a little broader than what it means for an IRP, right? So if I'm going back to more of a traditional way of thinking about the IRP, we'll have some different supply portfolio solutions, and we'll examine those sort of what we put together as possibly alternative preferred portfolios, and check those various preferred portfolios that were developed using all these RA metrics. So they should be adequate, but you never know. So you have to check on the back end. But like Lisa mentioned, each one might have different. You might have different LOLEs. You might have other of those metrics that would be different, that might be really, might be very, very different. Something with lots of firm base load might have a much better EUE, even though it has the same LOLE. So just kind of checking across all of those metrics, in addition with costs. So, but I don't think it's just checking the one preferred portfolio to make sure that it's good. I think it's going to be important to check a few different alternative preferred portfolios.
Thanks, Philip and Quinn, for that question. Yeah, Dennis, see your hand up.
Okay. I guess my question would be, how would demand response realistically affect the model?
Yeah. So in this cycle, the demand response is going to be treated as an existing resource. I don't know, Philip or Elizabeth, if you want to chime in on that modeling, but the demand response will quantify ELCCs for them and consider them to be existing resources in the portfolio development.
Yeah, so to clarify, demand response is going in as a resource. It'll have an ELCC value, just like the other resources, so it can contribute to peaks. And so we'll be able to see how the total picture of meeting the capacity works.
So not just existing, like Michaela said.
Well, because there's our set of
Potential
demand
addition.
response programs that we have. That's our existing programs. And then we're forecasting out into the future programs growing and more programs. So that's what we're working on.
Okay, thank you.
Sorry, existing in 2031 in future year, not existing today. That's what I meant by.
Thanks for that clarification. And looks like Lauren put her hand down. So we've got Quinn up next again, and then Ezra after that. Quinn.
I've already spoken. I'll let Ezra go first, and then I could go after him.
Sounds good, Quinn. Ezra.
Well, just following up on that last discussion, are there generic demand response resources that can be considered by the portfolio expansion model, or is it a fixed set that's projected for 2030?
So when we go into the resource adequacy analysis, we're going 5 years and then 10 years out. So we're seeing what the demand response will be looking at 5 years. So that's like current programs growing plus new programs that are a possibility to have happen by 2030 as well with forecasts. And so all those forecasts will be coming in through our CPA conservation potential assessment. They're also running the demand response assessment with that. So we'll be seeing the growth of programs plus new programs as a possibility. So we'll be seeing how all those programs look, and they all have different operations, and we can see kind of how they will help to meet the peak resources and put this all in the model for the modeling.
Okay, I mean, my question is there like a cost curve of generic demand response resources that the model can select alternatively to supply side resources, in addition to the ones that we know are going into place?
So for each program, we do have a cost of each program, and I think we'll be coming up when we go through in July. I'll have to double check of when we'll be going through the demand response programs. But yeah, so each program has its own costs to look at.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I wanted to ask if that's the 10% requirement from 1589. Is that going to be modeled in first, or like a binding constraint, or will it be here's what we think we can kind of have with demand response uh, based on what our load looks like and economic feasibility and everything?
I am gonna have to take that question back and get the answer back to you of how the demand response programs will be developed.
Sorry, my pause there. Thanks for that question, Quinn and Elizabeth. Sounds like we can get that included in the feedback report. Okay, great. And Lauren, and I see a couple other items in the chat. There is a follow-up to Ezra's question in there from Froylan. What are the DR VPP LCC estimates? Is that something for Michaela, Elizabeth, someone else?
We haven't gotten into that far in the modeling process yet, so we can't have an answer to that question what the ELCCs are for the DR resources yet.
Okay, thanks for that. And then yes, Lauren, sounds like a high priority for the members. So yeah, thanks for that comment. Okay, so I'm going to keep us moving because we have about 10 minutes left in this section. I know we've got a couple more, at least a couple more slides. So Michaela, I'll keep us moving along if that's okay.
Great. Okay. So in this next slide, we'll get into some more details about the modeling workflow and the inputs and outputs from it. So in this diagram, the kind of dark teal boxes are inputs or modeling steps that are PSE generated, and then the light blue are inputs or steps that are E3 generated. So starting kind of on the top left here, one of the key inputs, if we can go back a slide, thank you. One of the key inputs is the base load forecast. And so that is something that PSE produces. I think Elizabeth mentioned that's an upcoming topic for RPAG meetings. And so that's one of the key inputs into our tool and something we'll have just be consistent in the RA analysis and the rest of the 27 ISP and analytical work. That is one of the inputs into E3's process for generating hourly load profiles as the base load forecast, as well as historical hourly load. So E3 will generate hourly load profiles in this analysis. We have a model that we train on historical load and historical temperatures. And then we use that to develop hourly load profiles across a range of weather conditions. And that goes into both the regional recap model that E3 will use to then generate a market availability profile, as well as another input into the PSE recap model, which will be used to generate all the reliability metrics and outputs. So again, going back to that regional recap model, so this is the same type of modeling framework that we're using to represent PSE system, but the regional model represents kind of the Northwest footprint. And that model we'll use to get a picture of the market availability. So how much can PSE rely upon imports to do things like charge their storage? And in that analysis, we'll also kind of take a look at what would happen if the region as a whole was pretty short on energy and capacity, and how might that impact the RA metrics produced and the ELCCs of resources that are energy limited, such as storage. Kind of moving down to the middle, kind of left of this diagram, another key input into the PSE recap model is hourly renewable generation. And so E3 will generate hourly renewable generation profiles for all the different types of resources in PSE's portfolio, as well as resources that are considered in the portfolio expansion model to fill any kind of shortfall or gap or needs in the system. We use historical generation where it's available from existing PSE resources to calibrate that model. And one of the benefits of having this hourly renewable generation step, as Elizabeth kind of mentioned before, was that it allows us to get good correlation between the hourly renewable generation and hourly load profiles. We can develop these profiles with the same kind of assumption on weather conditions, and so that we could get good correlation between those two assumptions. Some other key inputs to the recap model that come directly from PSE are hydro budgets, so the availability of hydro from PSE's hydro resources, an hourly load forecast of EV charging, as well as characteristics for both their existing and planned resources, as well as generic or candidate resources that we'll model in recap. So out of recap, we'll develop those PRM metrics. We study 2 years and 2 seasons. So we develop a summer and winter planning reserve margin for PSE and look at 2 years, the 2031 and 37 years, the 5 and 10 years that Elizabeth mentioned before. And then we also generate those ELCC metrics. And in generating those metrics for candidate resources and existing resources, we also try to model the interactive effects of those resources. So those as we've been talking about, get put into PSE's portfolio expansion model. And then the output of that is that optimized portfolio that then goes back into some E3 analysis using a recap model to do that reliability check. See a question from Quinn.
Yeah, I'm curious about whether or not, like, kind of how historical hourly generation from hydro is modeled, given that hydro it's been kind of less reliable lately, and into the future probably will be.
Yeah, does PSE want to take that question first?
Yeah, I can take that. I actually will be going through what we're doing with hydro modeling in a couple slides. So we're trying to account for some historical, what's been recently happening with some of the historical hydro, and then looking also at some of the climate change hydro data as well, and looking how that will be impacting the hydro generation.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Okay. We can keep going, Michaela.
That's great. Quickly, I just wanted to call out on this diagram things that are changing from the 2025 portfolio analysis to the 27 ISP. So we go to the next slide. The first one I just wanted to call out is the representation of the market. In previous resource adequacy analysis, the market representation was utilizing the Council's Genesis model and PSE's WPCM model. And so in this cycle, we'll be using E3's regional recap model to develop that market availability profile. If we go to the next slide, the other big change is the hourly load profiles. In previous cycles, PSE developed these load profiles using temperature data. That was kind of consistent with some modeling from the council and the RMJSC studies. If we go to the next slide, one of the big motivations for doing that hourly load profile modeling, for having E3 do that, is also allowing E3 to generate hourly renewable profiles that then allow us to kind of correlate the renewable conditions, the conditions of our renewable generation profiles with our hourly load profiles and get a representation of how those two things are connected. So those are the three kind of big changes. And then I'll just wrap up here to kind of wrap up the description of E3 scope of work with all the resources we'll be modeling. As we've been discussing, E3 will evaluate the contribution of PSE's existing resources to meeting the planning reserve margin, and then identify kind of the shortfall of resources needed to be able to meet PSE's reliability standard. And then PSE will, in the portfolio modeling, use ELCCs for different generic resources that can be used to fill that shortfall. The table on the right is listing all of the generic candidate resources that E3 will be modeling. And as we've also discussed previously, the demand side resources are going to be considered existing or planned, they're already forecasted resources. So they're not in that generic candidate list on the right. This is kind of a simplified list, I would say, of all the generic resources. We have one bullet point here for land-based wind, but E3 will be modeling wind resources that PSE could access across a diverse set of geographies that could have different kind of capacity factors or hourly profiles based off when the wind conditions are, when the wind is blowing strongest in a given area, might be better suited to meet PSE's needs compared to a different area. That's all I think E3 had, and I see a question from Lauren, so hopefully we can wrap up and save within our time frame here.
Yeah, thanks, Michaela. So it occurs to me, just seeing advanced nuclear SMRs on here, is this modeling completely divorced from cost? Or
Yes.
are there cost assumptions that go into this? There are no cost assumptions that go into this model.
In the resource adequacy model, there are no cost assumptions.
Okay, so then maybe a question for the Puget folks is, how do the costs of these resources as a solution for PSE's resource adequacy needs, how do the costs get incorporated into the portfolio model? And we can come back to this later, but that's what strikes me here is we have some very expensive resources at the bottom of this list. And the fact that they're being looked at without cost considerations is a concern for me.
Yeah, thanks,
Yeah.
Lauren.
So we are actually going to be coming up onto the resource alternative section talking about costs. How this will work is the resource adequacy model is just setting up how these resources will contribute to peaks. And it's an input into our portfolio model. The other inputs include the cost of these resources. So when we create the portfolio, we are looking at optimizing the total portfolio costs, but we must meet peak requirements with resource adequacy. We must meet the renewable requirements. All of those are the requirements that we're trying to optimize to while considering the cost of these resources when they would be available as well. And I think there's a lot of questions coming up on timing of resources and costs of resources. So we are going to be getting to
Thanks, Elizabeth.
first alternative questions. And so we'll be going through the costs and the resources as well a little bit later in the presentation.
Thanks for clarifying that, Elizabeth. And yes, as we move into wrapping up this section, Michaela and Elizabeth, there was one more question I saw in the chat. So from Elisa, what's the assumed in-service date for 100-hour storage?
Yeah, so we do have a couple people who will be talking through the resource alternatives, and we'll be going through kind of some of these emerging resources, and that's actually up for some of our discussions as costs and potential online dates. So we're actually hoping to have a discussion around that topic.
Okay. Thanks, Elizabeth. Okay. Well, any other last questions before we keep moving? We're doing perfectly on time. So great job. Okay. Well, I'll keep us going because I know a lot of this conversation is intertwined. So let's keep moving. So thank you, Michaela. Now we're going to go back to Elizabeth and talk about hydroelectric modeling. So Elizabeth, over to you.
Great, thank you. So as requested, questioned earlier about the hydro modeling, we are making some updates this time. So if you want to go to the next slide. So in previous IRPs, some background, we had been using what was the 80-year historical hydro data set. And that was used through the 2021 IRP. And then through the CETA rules, we adopted into the climate change analysis. So this was an analysis done, originally done by the RMJOC, that's the River Management Joint Operating Committee. So what they did is looking at different temperatures and variabilities, and then accounting for what the stream flow would be on the Columbia River during those different temperature scenarios. And there were several different scenarios created. And then the Northwest Power and Conservation Council, as part of their 2021 power plan, took 3 of those scenarios out of that study and used those 3 scenarios in the plan. And so we adopted into those same 3 scenarios. We got the hydro and the temperature data coming together from those 3 scenarios and adopted that into the 2023 electric progress report for the climate change analysis. As we've been seeing a lot more of the recent trends of the hydro system, we're moving into more of what is kind of an ensemble approach. And so what we're proposing to do is mixing more of some of this historical generation with moving into the climate change data. So our idea is using the 30-year historical generation. This is similar to what the Bonneville Power Administration has started moving into with the 30 years. And so we'll be using the historical data in the early terms of our planning horizon. So our planning horizon is 2027 through 2050. So our proposal is to use the 30 years from 27 through 36. So that would be the hourly shapes that we would be using and the annual energy for those years. And then in the year 11, that would be 2037, start transitioning into the climate change data. So it would be kind of a weighted average transition through the end of the planning horizon into the climate change data. So by the time you get to the end, you'll be more into the climate change than some of the historical trends. And by doing this, this will allow us to capture some of those more recent stream flow data that we've been seeing, some of the more lower hydro conditions. It aligns with some of the more processes, what's going on in the region, and trying to capture more of the variability of what we're seeing in hydro generation as well. And so that's kind of overall our proposal for the adjustments we'll be making into the hydro. Just the second slide is kind of looking at how those seasonalities may change between the climate change data versus the 30-year average. So you can see a little bit of seasonal changes. Overall, what we're seeing is through the 30-year historical data, we are seeing slightly lower generation annually under the 30-year data versus the climate change data. So we're trying to capture more of this variability in the hydro generation just to make sure that we have enough resources in there. We're trying to meet our renewable requirements as well. So we need to be able to capture what's happening. I think there's a question.
Yeah,
Thanks,
Megan?
Elizabeth. Thank you. Yeah, I was wondering if you could speak a bit more as to why you chose 10 years to use the 30-year historical generation data and then moving to climate change data. And if you could just speak to a bit how influential climate patterns will be over the next 10 years. And if it seems like they won't be incorporated at all, and then 10 years from now, there'll be a sudden switch. I wonder if there's another approach that could start to build in that climate change data.
So we picked the 10 years, given that we're trying to capture current trends in the more recent years. So we were looking at a couple different options in there, making sure that we're capturing the current trends, making sure that as we're coming towards 2030 for meeting the CETA requirements, we're properly accounting for the variability of what could be happening with hydro in those early years. And then it's not going to be a sudden switch. We're actually doing a kind of a weighted average transitioning out there. So you won't see this sudden drop. We're trying to weight this in so that it's a little bit smoother into the climate change data as we adjust in.
Thank you. And that weighted average starts in 10 years to be
Yes,
phased
it
in?
starts in 2037. Yes.
Elizabeth, this is Lauren. I appreciate that choice. I think what I was going to say to Megan's question was I do think that the sudden flip of the switch led to some weird anomalies when BPA did this for their resource program. And so I'm glad that you guys are thinking of ways to kind of, make it so that that doesn't have a weird anomaly in the modeling. So thank you. I look forward to seeing how that works.
All right, thank you. Yes, we were concerned about kind of these sudden drops happening in later years, which is why we came up with this idea of a transition. And this will also be, this is used in our portfolio model. And as noted, this is going to be used in the resource adequacy. So we can try and capture a lot of this variability for the planning margins and how resources will help to for the resource adequacy as well.
Thanks for those questions and responses, Elizabeth. Super helpful. Okay. Well, I'll encourage us to keep moving if that's okay.
All right, so I will now be continuing into the resource alternatives. I think next slide, please. So overall, what we're trying to establish with the resource alternatives is we're trying to create a generic resource. So we're looking for the types of resources, looking at the evaluations as kind of the sizing, kind of some of these transmission zone regions where we can put resources into, and creating a mix of resources that we may see as kind of commercially available today, what might be coming into the future as well. So we have a mix of some commercially available resources today. We're also looking at what we're calling what these are emerging resources. And so this is technology that we think may be viable in the timeline of the ISP. But really, as we're going through these resources and what we're looking at, we are looking for feedback on the resource alternatives, where we're going to be putting them into transmission zones, the evaluations we'll be doing for these future resources and how that might be coming into play with our modeling and the portfolio as well. And a lot of uncertainty. So there's a lot of uncertainty of what resources may be available, the cost of these resources. There's a lot of policy uncertainty now as well. What types of fuels might be available into the future that are CETA compliant alternative fuels? So there's a lot of these questions. So we're looking more for a discussion. We have some kind of where we're going with this, but we do want to get feedback from you on how we should be looking at this and some of these evaluations as well. So I think next slide. Overall, so we did receive feedback through our 2025 analysis as we started work on that. Some of the big feedback we received really was around some of the emerging resources. We did get comments around why aren't we looking at enhanced geothermal technology? At the time, we didn't have a whole lot of information, but we have more information now. So we do have Steve who'll be coming in later to talk about the enhanced geothermal. And we'll be adding that into our resource evaluation. So that's been kind of added onto the list as the resources, part of the resource alternatives we're going to be looking at and we can discuss as well. I think next slide. So this is kind of looking at our list of resource alternatives. It kind of starts from where we were last year, but I did make some changes. Some of the bigger changes that we'll see on here will be under that base load. So before we just had kind of the small modular reactors as the resources available, but it's emerging. There's a lot of unknowns, a lot of about cost, when it will come in. So we have a combined cycle combustion turbine. This can be a natural gas turbine. It can also future run on some sort of alternative fuels. But it's being set up right now just for, it's an existing technology commercially available today. And then we've also added in the enhanced geothermal, which is also a new emerging resources. So these are types of resources that can meet base load, kind of our base load demands, and be available as a kind of energy supply resource. I think it was a question. So, oh yes, so that small modular reactor SMR, we are including that into the portfolio or options. We're looking at kind of some potential costs, estimates, and we can also discuss kind of timeframes of when we might think they might be in the portfolio. There's a lot of unknowns with that as well.
So my question was, when I see SMR, I assume nuclear, but here
Yes.
it says
Yes.
CPCP. So what are we talking about?
Yeah, okay, I will fix the labeling. I am talking about the nuclear small modular reactors, SMR.
Sorry, I blended the two bullets because there's no blue in there.
Easy to do. Lots of information on there.
And you're going to talk about the in-service dates?
We have options. That's definitely up for discussions on when we think it could be somewhere in the 2030s. We are unsure. We can give a guess. I'm sure there's a lot of guesses, but that's definitely the discussions we want to have of when we think some of these resources might be available for as a commercially available resource that we would be able to see actually coming about. So that's some of the discussions we'd like to have of when do we think, or when do you think they would be available? Or just some options there.
And sorry, one quick follow-up is, there's a ban on waste storage. So how does that fit in here? Is there no waste, or it's just adorable small little waste units? How does the nuclear waste issue get addressed?
I might ask Steve if he has, or Chris.
Yeah, Steve or I can talk to that very high level, but essentially, because the federal government has not come up with a final solution for storing the waste, what basically is being done temporarily is waste is going to be stored on these particular sites next to the actual power plants. So that's kind of the interim plan.
And is that allowable under current Washington law? I have no idea.
Yes, it is. And Columbia Generating Station, actually waste is stored on that site as well.
Yeah, that I knew. I just didn't know if it was okay. It was allowable for new facilities.
It's a good question. I believe it is. I haven't heard otherwise, but it's a good question. I can look into that.
Thanks, Chris. Other questions for folks on this slide?
I had a question earlier about the in-service date for 100-hour storage, and I'm not sure I heard that. I may have missed it.
Oh, are you asking about the dates also for the 100-hour storage?
Right.
I think, Chris, do you know some potential, like where a starting point might be, or this could also be up for the discussion?
So
we have estimates too.
For 100-hour storage, there's really only one OEM for that, and that's Form Energy. And I don't want to get into, I'm not sure what specifics we can share, but I'll just say generally the end of this decade is when I think commercialization of the technology is, full commercialization of the technology is expected. So latter half of this decade. I'm not sure what exactly we're assuming in the models, Elizabeth, but I would expect 2028, 2029.
I would say that's the optimistic answer, if you're just listening to what the developers are saying.
Right.
I mean, we could also go with some more conservative, more into the 2030s, early 2030s. So, I mean, this is really part of the discussion we want to have is what should we be looking at with these resources? I mean, potential could be 2031, 32 for some of these online dates later into the 2030s. So this is really part of the discussions we want to be having on these resources and what we're setting up for when they be coming in, especially since there's so much unknowns going on right now.
I see a hand up from Lisa.
Yeah, I mean, nobody knows, right? And so, there are different ways to handle this in the IRP, and one is just like you have different, off ramps or whatever we want to call it these days. Like here's what we plan to do because we don't know, and so we're being conservative and assuming, long duration storage, which would be great. We really need it. Will be available. Let's just say 20. Pick a year in the 2030s. We just want to be conservative in our preferred, what you ultimately your action, your assumptions for your action plan. But then you have these pathways in the ISP document. If it's available earlier and it's cost effective and it's working, we're going to jump earlier. So I don't know. I mean, that's just and it would affect the portfolio this way. And you can demonstrate like, look, if it was available in 2030, here's how we might change things.
Yeah. There's a couple sensitivities around availability date, how it might look, depending on timing, size, costs. No, thank you. And so I think next slide. So what I'm taking here is at the February meeting, we worked with the transmission group and they set up what are we calling these transmission zones. And so we'll be setting up kind of transmission constraints coming out of these different zones. And so now what we're trying to do is take our list of resources and put them into the different zones. So if we're setting up these different transmission regions, we have transmission to these zones. What resources can we get there? What are our options? And so we're trying to optimize out the resources with the transmission to make sure we're kind of getting this full optimal portfolio to put this together. And so what we've put out is like kind of where we're looking at. It was our starting point from last time. We've added in some more question marks of where can more resources be going. We're looking at, the solar. So each one of these like solars, some of the different solar shapes we're pulling in. This is each one of the little wind symbols or the different wind shapes we're creating. We can put batteries into different zones. We can put the peaking plants into different zones. And so this is really where we're trying to put together the transmission constraints with the resources to get kind of the bigger picture of where we can be looking at this. I think there's a question.
Yeah, why is there some kind of uncertainty about where batteries can appear on the map?
There isn't. This is just us assigning. I mean, you could probably put batteries into any of these zones. They can stand alone, they can co-locate with the wind and solar. So this is really where the feedback we want. Where should we be putting these resources if we should be looking at batteries in all the zones? As to try and help optimize the use of the renewable resources, hybrid co-location of resources as well.
Yeah, Lisa.
I'm just curious about no transmission zones from California, just building on the existing transmission and the historical exchange at different times of year, which I know is changing. But I'm just curious about California.
California. I'm gonna have to take that one back and talk to the transmission team to see where the options are there.
Thanks, Elizabeth.
And this is also about just taking like the excess during certain times of year too, right? Like the historical exchanges that we've had between the Northwest and California.
Yeah.
Thanks for taking that. back, Elizabeth. A couple more hands here. I'll get us through just because we're a little bit behind. Dennis and then Ezra. Dennis?
Looking at this map, and my question is, what additional resources would be needed to upgrade the long haul transmission lanes from the different areas?
Yeah, so we'll be working with the transmission team and actually creating a couple different sensitivities, different options. So each one of these kind of arrows represents different options. We'll be looking at, potential upgrades, more transmission. What if we don't have enough transmission, a lot of transmission constraints? So we'll be creating several different sensitivities to run through all the different options that could happen with transmission. At this point, we're just trying to set up the zones where the resources are going, and then we'll be layering in these different transmission constraints depending on the sensitivity we're setting up with the different options.
And I guess the other part of that question is, when you look at lead time for massive projects, I would imagine they're probably approaching some of those lead times you would have on some of that complicated emerging technologies, also like SMRs.
Yes. So I mean, with transmission, you have lead times as well. So this is actually going to be like a time series of options. This isn't static. This will be pretty dynamic coming in with a time series of options. And then that time series can be changing through the different sensitivities. So we'll be working through all these different options, trying to dynamically adjust these options and resources, considering all these long lead times, where we might want to go, where these resource options are, and trying to pursue what are the best resources, where we should be going, and kind of creating this comprehensive plan of resources and transmission.
Thank you.
Ezra.
Yeah, I mean, I was a little nonplussed by your response on the storage location. I mean, I understand there's a lot of things that you want input from the group on, but this is one that really we can't possibly provide answers to. I mean, it's a very complex modeling question having to do with transmission availability and resource characteristics and all the dynamics of how the system works together, where the batteries should optimally be located. And in fact, as you point out, you can put them anywhere. So, I mean, not anywhere, but it's one of the more flexible resources in terms of where you can put it. So I would really expect that to be something that you folks are looking at comprehensively and modeling and saying, where does it make sense to put it? I mean, we can't, sit here in an advisory group and say what the answer would be.
Yeah, I mean, so batteries can really help with optimizing your available transmission. If you have limited transmission, you can use batteries to store it and bring the energy over when, the wind or solar is not available. So we can definitely be putting the energy storage, optimizing it into any one of these zones to making sure you're optimizing your portfolio, your use of the resources, and your use of the transmission as well.
All right. I just hope that'll be thoroughly modeled and not, I mean, some things like when SMRs are available is kind of an arbitrary question at this point, but where the batteries should go, that is an analytical question. So I just want to urge you to look at it thoroughly. Thanks.
Thanks for those comments and questions. I'll keep us moving if that's okay, Elizabeth. And I think we're right towards the end of your section.
Yeah, Philip is gonna jump on right now as well.
Great. Good afternoon. That was great. That was great. A great discussion. So thank you all very much. Ezra, I noted that the response to our question marks for you was yes, consider those resources in those areas. So that's what we were looking for to see. Do you think that makes sense? And apparently it does. So as Quinn as well chimed in. So that was helpful. I want to mention there's another type of resource alternative that we're going to try to figure out how to incorporate into the ISP here, which is sort of the revision coming up to the BPA residential exchange. So that's basically a process that's put in place under the Northwest Power Act to ensure that the benefits of the federal hydro system are shared equitably across all of the region's residential and small farm customers. So in terms of you may have some questions about the details of that, and so we've asked Jason Kuzma to join us. Jason is a director and assistant general counsel at PSE and extremely knowledgeable about all of these types of issues. So, Jason, could you come on and explain about the residential exchange a little bit and what we're talking about?
Sure. The Northwest Power Act was put in place in 1980, and at that time, it was obvious that Bonneville was going to be reduced in its ability to make sales to the investor-owned utilities. So an arrangement was made out that there was going to be an exchange for those utilities that qualified. And what we're looking to do is on the CETA and the environmental attributes side with meeting CETA, the residential exchange, Puget and other utilities that have an ASC can sell it to Bonneville at that rate at an amount equal to the small farm or residential customers' load, and then buy back from Bonneville. In the past, that's only been a price differential that's been exchanged pursuant to various settlement agreements. And 7B2 of the Northwest Power Act creates certain restraints on the amount of financial charges that can go back and forth between Bonneville and the IOUs. But there are no restraints on the non-cost benefits. So one of the things that we're going to be advocating under the FY28 and beyond model of Bonneville is that there will be an exchange of the IOUs, all 6 of them, their residential and small farm loads with Bonneville. Basically, that would create a region-wide, I would view it as an amalgamation of a region-wide renewable portfolio standard that ultimately we would then receive back from Bonneville. It's not going to help on that capacity at all. It's only on an energy basis, but it's a way for our residential and small farm customers that if we continue as we're expected to be going forward, won't be receiving any benefits whatsoever from the Northwest Power Act as a result of the various issues that under 7B2 restrict the financial benefits. So we're trying to move it more towards a non-cost benefits through a way to try to take the CETA burden that has been in Washington placed largely on the IOUs and share that amongst a greater base with the public utility districts, municipals, and other Bonneville customers. So that's essentially the idea that we're going to be pursuing. And there was a letter sent earlier this week to the BPA administrator on behalf of all 6 utilities requesting that Bonneville begin the process of putting together a contract that would allow for the exchange of the cost and non-cost benefits under the exchange beginning in October 1st, 2028.
Thanks, Jason. Hopefully that helped clarify things a bit. We'll pause for a moment. Yes, Lauren.
Thanks for that, Jason. I'm not sure what that has to do with what we're here to do today. Can you, I mean, I know what the residential exchange program is. I understand, you know, I've seen the letter. I know what you guys are asking for. How is it relevant for this group? I think is my question. And what does it have to do with ISP?
I mean, it's a fair question. I think it's mostly about how does Puget look to one way to try to address our Clean Energy Transformation Act goals, because the ISP requires us to meet those goals as part of this. And we need to be putting it into the ISP as a result of the requirements of the CEAP and the CEIP statutes.
So Lauren, it'll affect if we do the physical exchange with BPA, right? It will affect the our need for non-emitting generation.
Okay, thank you.
Does that make sense? Yeah, so it'll affect our
Yes.
CETA, the energy component of the CETA.
Exactly.
Sounds like that helps, Lauren.
I think so. Yeah, I'll have to think a little bit more about whether you're providing the same treatment for BPA resources
Oh,
as you
I
would
see what
be
you're saying.
for renewable resources. I mean, it seems like you guys have been okay just claiming the attributes for compliance. So I'm just, yeah, I'm a little bit unsure if
Yeah.
it's equal treatment or not.
So Lorna, no, sorry, Lauren, yeah, I understand where you might be going with that. This is just basically, it's not that this is an incremental new resource. This would just be, if we were to be able to do the exchange and exchange of the environmental attributes, that will increase the number of environmental attributes we have towards CETA, which would then have a corresponding effect upon our need for resources that are non-emitting and renewable. It's not going to be dramatic, I'll be honest with you, but it will affect it and make it a little bit more of a socialized issue amongst the various residential and small farm customers. And it's not that we're going to be selecting that rather than something different. It'll be more along the lines of it will necessarily affect the number of
that you need to meet the target.
Exactly.
Okay. Thank you, Jason. Thanks for walking me through that.
Yeah, well, I understand now where you were going, so thank you for that.
Sometimes it takes a little bit of talking it out. So thanks for doing that. Okay, I'm gonna encourage us to keep moving just because we are pretty far behind, if that's okay. So I think we've got one more slide if we're wrapped up on this one.
Yeah, one more. Well, one more for me.
Yeah.
All right. So I'm gonna be going through the alternative fuels, and what we'll be doing with this is we are setting up for this generic new peaker. It'll be set up as a natural gas peaker with oil backup, with the option to switch to an alternative fuel for CETA compliance in 2045. And so the peaker is being set up with all the costs associated needed for being able to fuel switch, running as a dual fueled resource, and it will also have the costs needed for storage of these fuels on site and the size of the storage needed for the resource adequacy piece to make sure there's enough fuels as well. So what we're setting up to do is we don't know what the fuels will be in 2045 or some other estimated costs. So what I'm proposing is I've picked up a collection of different fuel options we could be looking at, what their costs are today. And then I've kind of averaged across the different costs, creating what is this generic alternative fuel. So this is kind of starting us at $35 today. And some of our options could be, we can either increase the costs at inflation. So we assume a 2.5% inflation per year, and that will get us to cost by 2045. We can also kind of create a cost curve. One of the options being we can grab kind of the cost curve forecast from the EIA, looking at diesel prices and moving this forward into the future. My question is do these resources or these resource options look, am I missing anything in here for resource options of fuels? And what are your thoughts about kind of inflating this out to 2045 costs, if you have thoughts on that as well? I think there's a hand up.
Yeah, my first question is, so you say CETA compliant fuels, does that mean zero carbon fuels?
Yes, so
Got
these
my
would be
copy of CETA in front of me.
Yes, so these would be essentially non-emitting renewable fuels, as stated in the CETA requirements.
Okay, how does methanol fit into that? I mean, we're looking at life cycle emissions.
I will rely on Steve if he's available. He knows more than methanol than me.
Right, and I guess
Yeah.
Megan also second Megan's also comment in the comments that aviation, if there is such a thing as sustainable aviation fuel, it's going to be enormous demand for it.
Yeah, similar to methanol too. So why methanol is listed, it is not a CETA compliant fuel yet, but it is in a similar production pathway as many of the other renewable and sustainable fuels listed as being CETA compliant. the shipping industry is at least somewhat likely to go the green methanol route just because their options tend to be pretty limited. So we're listing methanol as a potential option and something that is compatible with turbines in the future. Same thing with sustainable aviation fuel. It's compatible from a turbine technology perspective, and there is a possibility of supply. The observation, the comment by Megan is correct. It is likely going to be expensive, and therefore it may not be chosen, but as an option, it may be in the market. It will depend on the expansion of electrolytic fuels in general, of supply of biogenic CO2, and a whole bunch of other what ifs. And then you got to get down to price point. The aviation industry itself will have to agree upon a carbon pricing mechanism that all airlines around the world are going to have to comply to as well. So there's a bunch of what ifs that have to line up, but at a real elemental level, from a technology compatibility perspective, that's why we listed them. They're turbine compatible.
Okay, I mean, I get that. I mean, I think it's more likely that methanol will find use in shipping, I think, than being turbine compatible. And the idea that it's $28 as turbine compatible fuel seems very optimistic. And I think that the impact of that in bringing down your average price by including that one I think that distorts the result.
Yeah, I mean, this is a lot of the uncertainties. We just don't know what will be available by 2045, what regulations will be changing by then. We're just trying to set up for these turbines to be available for a liquid fuel option in 2045, whatever it may look like, whatever the options may look like. And we're trying to just make sure we're capturing all the costs associated for that as well.
Yeah, I mean, I really appreciate so many things that you guys are doing to try and make this all very reality based. I think that's one that is not as reality. Methane, like small modular reactors, has always been around the corner in terms of a carbon-free fuel, and it's likely to be around the corner for a long time.
I guess there's
opinion.
I think you're generally right about, price not being known could be optimistic. I would offer as a data point that as of today, renewable diesel is right now cheaper than fossil diesel. And that is a bit of a quirk in the market that most people don't understand, including myself. It should be more expensive. It's harder to make. The feedstocks are more expensive. So how is it cheaper than fossil? So is methanol going to follow a similar track? I don't know. Strange things going on in the market right now.
Thanks.
Thanks for that feedback, Ezra, and that back and forth, everyone. Helpful feedback.
Yep. That is the last of my slides. I'll be handing it over to Steve now.
Sounds good. Thanks so much, Elizabeth, and thanks everyone for your thoughtful comments and questions. So Steve, we're kind of behind schedule, so we'll see how far we can get. But Steve's going to be talking about emerging resource geothermal modeling.
Okay, thank you very much. Good news for the audience here. I think it's just 4 slides, so I will get through them as succinctly but thoroughly as possible, and then have some time for questions. So let's move into the first slide here. Okay, so what are we talking about with enhanced geothermal energy? So the concept of geothermal energy is not new. It has been around for quite a while, and there is some amount of production nationwide using the first generation of technologies. So harnessing geothermal up until very recently has really looked around sources of heat and water coming out of the ground. So in areas where you've got high hot rock conditions and there's naturally occurring water, you are able to basically connect them with a steam turbine and generate power that way. What enhanced geothermal does is removes the water equation from the power generation side and looks really just for areas of hot rock. So if you can find hot rock, then the premise of enhanced geothermal is that 2 sort of supply wells can be drilled, and then return wells can be drilled down into the same general formation, and using hydraulic fracturing, create a closed loop system. Water is then brought in, run down the supply well, is heated up by the earth, turned into steam, comes back through the return well, drives the steam turbine. The water is then condensed back into water, pumped back down through, and rinse and repeat. So looking at all up and down many parts of the country, including the West Coast, there's reason to believe that there is enough hot rock to be able to provide a considerable amount of energy. So there's been quite a bit of news in the last couple of years about some advancements, particularly in the Nevada-Utah area and around the Forge project funded by the Department of Energy. These are very promising developments, and we're taking a look at them. One of the things that we have sort of observed and learned in talking to this nascent industry is that the temperature required to really know where to look and where to drill is not particularly well known. A lot of the temperature you really need to know at depths of 10 to 15,000 feet, and that's data that really comes out of the oil and gas industry. And since there isn't a lot of native oil and gas deposits in the Northwest, it's difficult to know where to go. So the graphic here is from the geothermal liftoff report that was published around this time last year. So looking at sort of what is known today, or at least what is currently speculated, there is a considerable amount of hot rock up and down the West Coast, and that is promising from a resource development. What we know is from drilling and looking at where exactly we would go. Number one is the temperature gradients, but two, there's also a factor of the geology at these depths that has to be better understood. There are certain tensile or compressive forces in the earth, depending on which way tectonic plates are moving. That has a lot to do with the longevity of the well itself. So if there's compressive forces and you go down and perform the fracturing processes to open up those wells, the earth is going to want to naturally seal them back up, resulting in either a pretty expensive plant because you have to go back in and refrac, or you'll end up with a shorter lifespan. So finding the right combination of hot rock and those tensile forces, that's going to be sort of some of the key elements on how enhanced geothermal takes off in the West, primarily the West Coast. Next slide. So what we're really thinking about here is how we build a policy and environment that supports the development and expansion of these resources. You're looking at significant amount of capital expenditure just to do the exploratory work. How we go about doing it as a region and engaging with the developers to understand where to go and where to look is probably one of the first things that we're going to have to do here. Another thing that we are doing in this space is understanding from a modeling perspective how these systems work. There's not one commercial operation yet. Fervo's got some really exciting stuff going on at Cape Station. Hopefully that will come online in the next couple of years. But understanding from a modeling perspective and getting some baseline understanding of the costs and how these things operate, either from a capacity standpoint or from a baseload energy standpoint, is something that is not well understood. Now, hopefully we will able to learn a little bit more here in the next couple of months, or maybe even up to a couple of years, and we're able to build a portfolio that actually does incorporate them. But for right now, part of what we're doing is just trying to learn more about them and how they work. Next slide. So why we're interested in this technology? Before I move on, Lisa, question.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to know on the prior side, like how expensive is it to characterize the temperature geology? And I mean, is this akin to dry holes, or is this like so much less expensive? And and what form of, would it be done at a utility by utility level, state by state, developer by developer? Just trying to get a sense. Federal support?
Federal support would be ideal, but state support I would probably list as the next most important. The dry hole risk is probably very real. You're looking at rigs that are upwards of $500,000 a day. So, $10 to $20 million. That's just to figure out the temperature and the geology at the depth. So, understanding where to go and how much to drill is fairly expensive. Okay. Next question or next slide. Okay, so why we're interested in this. They, at least from what we understand today, they do have the capacity to operate both in a clean, flexible 24/7 capacity, similar to an operating plant of a small modular nuclear. Some potentially could operate more in a resource capacity where they're able to ramp up and down depending on really the flow of the water through the formations. And they do have some capacity to integrate fairly well with other renewable resources such as wind and solar. From a risk perspective, if we can get through the temperature characterization sort of challenge there, what is nice about this is it's a combination of two relatively mature technologies, and that is the drilling and fracturing technology. That's something that we've figured out pretty well over the last 30 years, and closed loop steam turbines, which obviously have been around for a very long time. So combining those two lowers the overall risk and makes it a little bit more enticing in a business model that really isn't designed to take a lot of new risk. If you are in a position and you find a really great spot that has a lot of resource capacity, multiple wells can be drilled from the same platform. So it's very possible that from one footprint, significant energy capacity can be developed. Upwards of 1,000 megawatts would not be uncommon. So from from an expansion and land use perspective, there's a lot going for it. You're simply imagine like spokes on a wheel. If the hub is the plant itself and you can drill multiple directions and the ground has the heat to sustain it, then you could generate significant power out of one facility there. On some of the risk ledger, again, it's lack of data, particularly in the Northwest, about geology and temperature. Utah and California and Nevada are much more favorable from that perspective. Eastern Oregon appears to be quite favorable. Southern Washington has some good stuff as well. One would think, given our volcanic nature up here, that we do have the right conditions, but understanding exactly where is still a bit of an unknown. The lifespan of the wells is also an unknown at this point. The O&M on these plants is a little bit higher than I think I was initially expecting, largely because it's a levelized cost of re-stimulating those fissures. So under some conditions, if the geology supports it, you may have many years of relatively low cost operation. But if you have to go back in and re-stimulate those wells, that could add to some higher cost resource. So those are, again, things that are unknown. Hopefully in the next couple of years, as some of the first generation plants come online, particularly down in the Nevada area, they're able to share some data with us and we're able to learn more about operating characteristics and build that into our portfolio. I think that's it. Yeah, any questions?
Thanks, Steve.
Okay.
Not seeing any yet, and we still have one more part of a presentation. So what we could do, oh, Lisa, did you have a question?
I just had a quick one.
Yeah, sure.
I mean, DOE is really, U.S. Department of Energy is really interested in geothermal. In fact, it's like one of the only renewables that that's in the president's budget for support.
Right.
So I'm just wondering what the potential, I mean, this is not really a Puget role, right? Like Puget's not all of a sudden going to become like a geothermal developer with expertise. So I'm just wondering, I mean, this is just like something that Puget tracks, right? It's not going to be directly asking for federal funds for this or that, I assume, because there will be opportunities.
Yeah, I think that's right. We did apply for a grant last year with the Department of Energy to study geothermal. It wasn't any exploration; it was just modeling and studying. But yeah, I think that's right. I think where we come into the picture and where we play is really sort of articulating the need and understanding how it fits into a at least cost clean portfolio that helps us meet our 2045 goals and beyond. So I think indicating the need, helping developers understand our energy system is also something that we can provide. That's a no cost action on our part. Give them a target to hit. Learning that is particularly valuable to them. But in terms of putting either customer or other capital at risk to go do exploration, don't see that happening under the current design of the business model.
Yeah, but in subsequent procurements, it's possible, to put out a renewables procurement and I'm sure you have, that includes the potential for geothermal.
Yes.
Require different contracting terms because of the risk. I assume.
I think that's largely correct. It is interesting right now that at least in talking to Fervo, they don't have to bid into anyone's RFP. People are knocking on the door because they're the first game in town. So hopefully more players come into the space and there'll be a diversity of options, a little bit more competition, a little bit more exploration, just to make sure we're getting the best deal for our customers. But I think that's correct. Thinking about the risk differently, thinking about the partnerships different, understanding how it fits in from a regional transmission perspective. I think those are important elements to understand how geothermal fits in.
Yeah, I assume there's also the potential for negotiating some kind of potential contract that you could take to the commission, and folks could weigh in. I mean, I don't know the procurement rules in Washington, but I'm just saying, if an RFP is not the appropriate vehicle for geothermal, and that's a big if, but if it's not, and geothermal appears to do very well in your portfolio analysis, and it would be nice to have a baseload renewable, what is it that PSE could do? And there may be some discussion with the commission and stakeholders about that.
There very well could be. Agreed.
I guess the one thing I just wanted to add is, Lisa, I think about this, especially the advanced geothermal, because I'm really excited about this stuff, this version, as well as the next version of advanced geothermal, as possibly being really, really important. But I think we'll wind up doing with most of the emerging technology type resources is approaching it. I think I love the way you described looking at these things where we don't know we don't know when, we don't know what they'll cost, we don't know how they'll operate. And so we're probably not going to plan on building a power plant that nobody's ever built before. That's not what we're going to propose, right? But what does make a lot of sense to me is the way you described saying, well, what if these things were available at some point in the future? And I'm thinking, to be real, I don't know that we want to build something brand new. It better be showing you can run it for 5 years. And we could do something along those lines of saying, well, we're going to be kind of conservative on when these things might actually be commercially available. If they were, would it change what we would do if we just looked at things that are more commercially available? How would it impact those plans in the future? So I think that's how we would kind of use these things, because there's a lot of things to get over and around. But I like the way you described it earlier of saying, think about it like if this was available with reasonable cost escalation terms, right? Do you think that we would actually, how would that affect our plans today? I think that kind of helps solve a lot of these weird questions of what to do with it and how much are you going to rely on it.
Thanks, Philip, and Lisa and Steve for all of that conversation dialogue. I'm going to keep us moving because I know we're super tight on time and we still have one more topic. So I'm going to transition us rather quickly over to Katrin Olson, who's going to be talking about generic resource costs.
Hi, I'm Katrin Olson. I'm an associate energy resource planning analysis at PSE, and we really want to have a discussion today surrounding capital costs for generic resources. Can you go to the next slide? Thank you. So some of the questions we are posing are, how should we handle uncertainty around tariffs? How should we handle changes in policies surrounding investment tax credits and production tax credits? And how should we handle uncertainty in emerging resources, technology, timing, and costs? You can go on to the next slide. Thank you. So Black and Veatch presented at the RPAG last year when we were working on the 2025 resource planning analysis. They discussed the technologies we are modeling in the 27 ISP and the capital cost for those resources. We have added a few resources since the work of the 25 resource planning analysis and have an updated draft of resource capital costs. All the costs I will be presenting today are in 2022 dollars and vintage year 2025. All the costs taken from the NREL ATB are from the conservative cost curve. So these costs include engineer, procure, and construction costs, or EPC, and the owner's cost. This includes the total cost to build the plants, buying the turbines or the pieces, bringing it in, constructing it, and the owner's cost. These costs do not include tax credits, interconnection costs, and lease fees. We'll be bringing in all those other pieces at a later time, and those will be the final costs for the generic resources. Next slide. So these are some of the emerging resources in the 27 ISP, nuclear SMR, offshore wind, and enhanced geothermal. We are proposing using the capital cost from the 24 NREL ATB for these resources because they have more up-to-date information on these emerging resources. And given the current risks around these resources, we feel that the ATB has a more conservative cost estimate. But given that these are emerging resources, should we be adding an uncertainty or risk percentage adder to the capital cost for these resources? And for future planning, where should we be going with some of these resources? We're looking for RPAG feedback here.
I'm sorry, did you say what ATV? What is that?
The NREL ATB,
Oh,
yeah.
what does that stand for? Do you know?
Somebody, Elizabeth.
Yeah, the ATB stands for the Annual Technology Baseline. So every year, NREL releases estimated costs. It's based off of kind of some national averages and what they're seeing in trends of resources. So we pulled the new report for 2024. The 2025 report is not ready yet, but we have pulled the new one so we can do a comparison of the cost estimates.
Can you share a link to that? I mean, it's interesting that they have, since it seems to be historic data or current data, they'd have nuclear SMR, for example, or any of the emerging resources. I'd just be curious to see the details.
Yeah, no, and thank you, Lisa. She posted a link for that as well, but we can also share in our feedback too.
Thanks, Ezra. Other feedback. Yes, Dennis.
You know, when I look at those options of the technologies, into the future, I think of probably limited companies, at least now, and maybe even them that can do this. So I would imagine the cost would be up just due to the demand around the world for this kind of technology. And even just the skill sets in some of this to be able to do that. But wow, you know, the capital projects I've been involved in, I mean, just material costs have gone up significantly just in a handful of years. So even looking at 50% doesn't really look that much when you're looking at a project out, you know, 10, 15, 20 years. I mean, it can be significant. So I would go very conservative with that.
Thanks, Dennis. Okay, we've got another hand up.
If you look at the nuclear industry history, you know, several 100% is far more typical for where costs actually go relative to initial estimates.
Yeah, I think about this as sort of like if anyone's familiar with finance, like a yield curve. Like the further out you get, the further out you get, the more uncertainty you just inherently have. I mean, granted that we're sort of inversing the yield curve here uh, at the current moment, but uh, it's definitely maybe a different and better way to think about uncertainty.
Thanks, Quinn. Do you want to keep going, or would you like to continue trying to get more feedback? I know you've got a few more slides.
Yeah, we can keep going.
Okay, sounds good.
Next slide, please. Oh, yeah, thank you. For short duration storage, the lithium ion battery costs were informed by Black and Veatch and the current 24 RFP. Black and Veatch also provided us with capital costs for the compressed air mid duration storage and iron air long duration storage. For the 27 ISP, we are looking to model a mid duration storage option. The NREL ATV also publishes costs on pump storage and 8-hour lithium ion batteries. The cost for compressed air mid duration storage is coming in lower than both the pump storage and the 8-hour battery. We're proposing going with the lower cost resource, but we're open to feedback on what mid duration storage option we should go with. Given the uncertainty and risk that both compressed air mid-duration storage and iron air long-duration storage are emerging, should we be adding a percentage adder to them? Given policy and tariffs, should we be adding a percentage adder to the lithium-ion battery? If there's any feedback from RPAG on that, if not, we can also move on to the next slide.
I was just gonna say, just because we are at 4:02, or sorry, 3:02, and folks did only have this scheduled till 3, Katrin. So I was just gonna suggest that maybe we get through the rest of the slides and then we revisit this topic at the June meeting. I think I just wanted to propose that and see if I could get a couple thumbs up for that. I just don't want to rush us too much. And also, some people are gonna have to drop off and we'll miss some people's feedback.
Sounds
Okay.
good to me.
Okay, great. So let's just kind of get through the last few slides and then we can come back to this in June. Thank you everyone for your patience.
Great, thank you, Annie. So you can move on to the next slide. So these are the 3 thermal units we're modeling in the 27 ISP. For these units, the fuel costs are not included in these capital costs. Black and Veatch provided us with a peaker that can handle multiple different fuels. Before 2045, this will be a natural gas peaker with a backup fuel, and then after 2045, it will be a CETA compliant fuel peaker. We are also modeling a hydrogen peaker. We got costs for this peaker from Black and Veatch. The technology for these peaker units is newer and it was chosen since it can handle fuel switching and the costs include storage for the fuel. And as Elizabeth stated earlier, we are looking to add a combined cycle plant and proposing using the capital cost from the 24 NREL ATP. You can move on to the next slide. Renewables. So costs for both wind and solar were informed by Black and Veatch and the 2024 RFP. And with policy uncertainty, should we be adding a percentage adder to these resources? Next slide, please. So that'll bring us back to the discussion questions that we'll have to pick up at a later time.
Thanks, Katrin. So yeah, we'll revisit these questions in June, but also please feel free, you have the deck. You've also heard quite a bit of share out from PSE today. If there's feedback you already have in mind that you'd like to give, please feel free to email that in. We can put that email address into the chat again. And then of course you can just put it directly into the chat if you'd like. So thank you so much for your patience while we wrap this up. I know we're a bit over. What I'm going to do is actually just take us past the charter discussion. I think we'll just punt that to June as well. It's not necessarily an urgent issue. So as you know, we were going to try to adopt the charter in principle today, and we can just do that next month. And hopefully we'll have time to do that then. So we can keep going past this conversation, a couple more slides, and we'll go into next steps. So I'll just go ahead and start moving us into next steps and public comment. We've heard, and you can go to the next slide, quickly cover this. This is also in your packet if you want to review it in depth a little bit more, but we've heard from a few of the RPAG members that during during some of the interviews that we've done that it would be helpful to understand how feedback is received, tracked, and used in this process, in the ISP process. So we're introducing this visual for the first time during this meeting to help show that cycle. It really just shows you what happens before the meeting, the day of the meeting, the week after, and 4 weeks after and before the next RPAG meeting, both for this group and the Equity Advisory Group, and for consideration of the public feedback that's received. So whether, shared in meetings or submitted in writing, the feedback does get reviewed, summarized, and ultimately used to inform future planning in the ISP process. And so this helps try to portray that in a way that's visual. And we'd love to see if you have any thoughts on how we can improve this, and feel free to share that feedback either in writing, or we can talk about it at the next meeting. We'll keep this as part of a deck that will reoccur at future meetings as well. All right, next slide. All right, so we've already talked a little bit about some of these dates. So the feedback form for this meeting will close on the 22nd of May. We have 2 June RPAG meetings, one focused on electric vehicle forecasting, and that's an information session on the 18th. And then the regular RPAG meetings are going to occur on June 24th, and then again on July 29th. And then we'll be giving you the month of August off just due to summer activities. You can keep going. Of course, we've talked about this already several times, but you can email PSE, you can provide feedback at their form. You also can subscribe to their email list, or you can visit their website. So lots of ways to engage and get information, and we'll pop those in the chat again. Thanks, Ben, for doing that. And before we move into public comment, I always just like to pause and see if there's any last questions or comments from RPAG members that you didn't get to say before, and or can't hold until June. I'll just give you a moment. I know we're quite a ways over time, but just want to give you a pause to do that. Great. So I'll keep us moving. So quick note on a few updates to the public comment. If you can go to the next slide. We've increased the time from 2 to 3 minutes per speaker. And if we wrap early, which we aren't doing today, I'll just use my best judgment to extend time a bit, as long as it's fair to everyone. And just a reminder, we can't really allow folks to donate their time to others. And public comment is really meant to provide brief input, not really a replacement for detailed written feedback. So PSE will do their best to get feedback reports out before the next meeting so that we can keep things moving. Next slide. All right, so now we're going to go ahead and shift into the public comment portion. We just have one public commenter today, Don Marsh, that's going to be providing comments. And if you are a member of the public and you didn't raise your hand before, please feel free to raise your hand now, and I'll get you in the queue as well. Again, we have 3 minutes for public comments, and I will get my timer up on the screen. For those of you that are just joining us on the phone, I put a 3-minute timer up on the screen so that folks can share their comments and we can wrap up within those 3 minutes. This isn't Q&A, but your input will be captured in PSE's written feedback summary. And in the future, if we run short on time and we don't get to everybody, please feel free to put your thoughts in writing, of course, via that feedback form as well. Okay, so I'll go ahead and start sharing my screen. Oh, let me get rid of all the Zoom items. Just a second. Okay, and Mr. Marsh, are you there?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. And would you like to share video?
Sure.
Okay.
How do I
I
do
remember you had asked how to do that last time, so it's just making sure that you knew how.
Yeah.
Okay.
Let's see. Do I need to enable something? I only
Yeah,
see.
there should just be a video option on the bottom left-hand side of your screen,
No,
depending on your
no,
device.
only an audio thing. So
Okay.
I guess I'll
Okay.
just do audio for now.
Okay. Sounds good. Well, I will start the clock. Your time has started.
Okay. Thank you. Good afternoon. Today, I want to speak directly to RPAG members and encourage you to ask PSE for improved public participation in the resource planning process. I will address 3 problems: the RPAG charter, IAP2 participation levels, and the feedback report. Regarding the RPAG charter, PSE's proposed changes have not been visible to the public. We would like to understand what the changes are and be able to provide our own suggestions. The RPAG is not a secret society, and all aspects of its purpose and process should be transparent. Regarding IAP2 levels, the RPAG charter says, be clear about the level of engagement on the International Association of Public Participation Spectrum in which PSE is engaging the RPAG throughout the IRP process. So far, in the 3 RPAG meetings that have been held this year, the IAP2 level has not been stated once. For an advisory group, we would expect most topics to be at the involved level or higher, but most of the topics presented so far appear to be at a lower level. Regarding the feedback report, it appears to be a faithful record of comments received by the public. It is not. PSE uses unstated policies and deadlines to restrict what appears in the report. For example, in the last feedback report, I inquired about PSE's analysis and modeling assumptions on BPA's imbalance market decision. PSE just redirected us to an old and opaque presentation to the UTC last August. When I asked for 3 additional sentences to be added to the feedback report, PSE refused, claiming a deadline had passed even though they had just revised the report. For the record, these are the 3 sentences I asked PSE to add to the feedback report. Quote, PSE's presentation in docket UE 240-537 was helpful, but raised questions due to its age, almost 9 months old, and subsequent developments regarding BPA's decision and encouraging progress on the EDAM governance question. Can you tell us when PSE will publish an update with more details on PSE's modeling and assumptions? These decisions are directly pertinent to RPAG's mission, as well as progress towards clean energy implementation, reliability, and customer costs. End quote. It appears
Mr. Marsh, you have about 30 seconds left.
Thank you. It appears that PSE does not want its analysis to be understood or questioned by the public. Sierra Club will submit written comments asking for more information. Thank you very much.
Thanks for your comments, Mr. Marsh. And thanks for keeping it to 3 minutes. Appreciate that, especially given our time constraints today. All right, well, I'm going to go ahead and move us into wrap up. Thank you for everyone that stayed on afterwards. Kara Durbin's going to thank everyone and end the meeting for us.
No, thank you, Annie. So I promise to be quick. I know we're over time. On behalf of PSE, I wanted to thank everyone for the thoughtful dialogue and engagement that we had today. We definitely covered a lot of ground. So as you reflect on today's meeting, if you have feedback for us, and Annie, you went over the process slide a little bit earlier, and we hope you do have feedback, please do send it our way in the next week. And if you have questions after that 1 week mark, please still send them our way and we'll consider them and include them in the next feedback report. So please keep the dialogue open with us. There will be, as you close out of today's meeting, for RPAG members, please take a minute to fill out the post-meeting survey. It should just pop up for you. So we'd love to hear your thoughts on how today's meeting went and anything that we can improve in the future. So thanks, everyone. Really appreciate all your engagement today.
Thanks, Kara. And I'll just do one last plug for the survey. When you sign off, you'll get a survey that pops up. Please feel free to, or we really, really want you to fill it out because we want to get your feedback. And it just should take a few minutes. It's only 3 questions. So really appreciate that. Thanks, everyone, and have a great rest of your day. Bye.
Thanks, y'all.
Long, thank you.